What happens if you lock a living being in a room where absolutely all its physical needs are met, but it is completely denied the chance to be loved? And this terrifying psychological riddle would soon shake the scientific world to its very core. In 1960, an innocent newborn baby rhesus macaque monkey became the subject of a dark prison experiment. It was placed inside a cold, windowless stainless steel box, an apparatus its creator chillingly named the Pit of Despair. Inside this grim metallic cell, the helpless animal was given an endless supply of fresh, automated food. It had constant access to pure water, flowing seamlessly from a laboratory tube. The isolated chamber was kept in a state of absolute, sterile cleanliness, completely free of any bacteria or diseases. There were no predators, no physical dangers, and zero threats to its biological survival. Yet, despite these perfect conditions, after a few years inside the box, the creature was completely dead. It was dead mentally and emotionally, even though its physical body was still breathing. This was not an isolated test, nor was it the most brutal setup in this researcher's career. But this specific chamber was built to find an uncompromising, terrifying answer to a question that had haunted him for decades. He wanted to know. It's what truly happens to a living being when you don't deprive it of food. And you don't deprive it of warmth. You leave it a safe roof and perfect health. But you forever strip away the basic biological necessity of being needed by someone else? The man behind this dark project was Harry Harlow, a leading professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In his era, academic science was aggressively dominated by a cold, radical doctrine known as behaviorism. The most powerful and influential mind behind this movement in America was the psychologist John Watson. Watson publicly preached to the nation that maternal love and affection was nothing but a dangerous, coddling psychological excess. He strictly taught parents that a child attaches to its mother solely due to a primitive feeding reflex because she is a food source. To these behaviorists, a human infant was no different from a mechanical automaton and merely reacting to physical reinforcement. But Harlow fundamentally refused to accept this cold logic and chased a scientific refutation for over 20 years. Year after year, he constructed new experimental setups inside his hidden, restricted laboratory. He began forcefully separating newborn baby macaques from their real mothers immediately after birth, and during these early isolation tests, he discovered that the lonely infants would desperately cling to ordinary terry cloth towels on the floor. These basic rags, meant only for cleaning the cages, became their only substitute for maternal warmth. The moment laboratory assistants stepped in to take the dirty cloths away for washing, the baby monkeys erupted into a frantic, terrifying panic. They screamed in terror, tore at the cage walls, and showed signs of unbearable psychological trauma. Through these heartbreak observations, Harlow documented a devastating, undeniable pattern dozens of times on paper. An infant deprived of basic tactile contact was not just sad, it lost the very capacity to live. But the new Pit of Despair was to become the absolute crown of his research work. It had to be a crystal clear experiment, with results that no one in the world could dispute. The scientist built this special apparatus in the most secluded wing of his primate laboratory. The chamber was designed to guarantee that the macaque inside could not see a single living being. It remained alone with its thoughts in absolute sensory isolation for months and years. Even the laboratory maintenance staff never entered this room, as all feeding processes were automated. According to Harlow's precise medical calculations, physically, the monkey could safely live in this box for decades. But the reality turned out to be much darker and more terrifying than any theoretical predictions. In the very first days of isolation, the young macaque paced frantically around the chamber, letting out piercing cries. It tried to find a way out, scratched the smooth steel sheets of the wall, and jumped onto the ceiling mesh. However, this turbulent period of resistance did not last long and quickly faded. Away soon came a prolonged, heavy phase, which the scientist officially named behavioral death in his report. The miserable animal completely stopped moving aimlessly around the cage and barely touched the food. The macaque huddled in a corner and completely ceased to react in any way to external stimuli and bright light. When, after long months, Harlow finally opened the chamber and took the monkey out, it made absolutely no attempt to run away, hide, or protect itself. It lay listlessly on the laboratory table, submissively accepting any external damage. Then, it would slowly stand up, walk heavily a few steps to the side, and lie back down on the cold floor in the exact same apathetic posture. However, by no means all victims of isolation remained quiet and apathetic. At the exact same time, a second group formed on the opposite end of the psychological spectrum. These were the macaques that Harry Harlow released back into the general colony of their peers. At the end of the tests, the behavior of these individuals within the troop was absolutely frantic, unpredictable, and extremely aggressive. They launched brutal attacks on other peaceful monkeys for absolutely no apparent reason. They proved completely incapable of entering into normal social contact, forming healthy bonds. These traumatized animals could not mate normally due to a gross disruption of their instincts. And those females that still managed to give birth to infants completely refused to recognize and protect them. They abandoned their newborn. babies to their fate in the most dangerous parts of the shared enclosure. Their insane outbursts of rage could not be stopped, even by harsh violence from the alpha males. In the worst and most neglected pockets of this colony, anomalies began to grow rapidly. Wild and twisted forms of destructive social behavior began to appear en masse. Such eerie aberrations had never been produced before by any functioning monkey society. Harry Harlow carefully recorded this total collapse of the psyche in his laboratory logs. He understood that the isolation he created had caused a profound internal trauma to the subjects. However, the American researcher did not want to simply destroy and cripple living beings for the sake of dry data. At a certain point, he firmly decided to try to find an effective cure for this severe madness. He developed a new, unique methodology of reverse socialization for his broken charges. For this, the scientist took macaques that were completely crippled by months of confinement in a solitary chamber and carefully placed them in open enclosures with ordinary, completely normal monkeys. Harlow officially called these new healthy companions monkey therapists in his writings. The most important feature was that these therapists were significantly younger than their sick peers. The infant therapist still absolutely did not know how to display reciprocal aggression, malice, or fear. They just approached the withdrawn macaques time and time again and compulsively tightly hugged them. The little monkeys persistently pressed against them with their whole bodies, absolutely not demanding any reciprocity. This surprising and touching rehabilitation process continued, uninterrupted for many months, and contrary to the initial skepticism of many of the professor's colleagues, the method of warm hugs really worked. After a long time, some macaques crippled by isolation began to gradually return to life. They began to show a first timid interest in the world around them and started to play gently with the infants. But deep, heavy mental scars still remained inside these creatures forever. Their shattered psyche was literally glued back together from small fragments, widowed and empty. It could never become completely the same as before. The publication of the results of Harry Harlow's experiments immediately caused a massive wave of public condemnation. Many scientists, journalists, and animal rights activists openly criticized the professor for his excessive, borderline cruelty. However, despite these ethical debates, it was these experiments that made a quiet and monumental revolution in science. The fact is that before Harlow's research, a terrible approach to raising children dominated the entire civilized world. In the orphanages, nurseries, and hospitals of that time, infants were kept in conditions of total, absolute sterility. Medical nurses and nannies were strictly forbidden to pick up infants unless absolutely necessary. Doctors sincerely believed that frequent tactile contact would introduce infection or simply spoil a child's character. As a result of this cold approach, thousands of abandoned children grew up for years in complete emotional isolation. In just 2 days, stable students of a prestigious university turned into terrified, broken victims. And their classmates of yesterday tried on the roles of cruel, sadistic executioners. Empathy and compassion indicators inside the artificial prison crashed to absolute zero. The guards began to compulsively invent sophisticated punishments during night shifts. They forced the prisoners to clean prison toilets with their bare hands and stand at attention for hours. Already, by the 36th hour, one of the prisoners began to have a severe psycho-emotional breakdown. The guy wept uncontrollably, screamed with unmanageable rage, and completely stopped thinking clearly. The scientists had to release him from the basement ahead of schedule, as his psyche was completely destroyed. However, Philip Zimbardo himself became so deeply immersed in the new role of prison warden that at first he flatly refused to interrupt this dangerous, out-of-control experiment. The prison began to live its own, frightening life, completely isolated from the outside world. On the third day, the guards began to invent new ways of moral pressure. They deprived the prisoners of the right to use a real toilet, giving them plastic buckets instead. The cells filled with filth, and the students had to sleep right on the bare floor. Ordinary young people were rapidly losing all human dignity. On the fourth day, rumors of a planned mass escape began to spread among the inmates. Zimbardo and the guards panicked and tried to transfer the prison to a real secured building. When this plan failed, the guards began to retaliate against the prisoners with redoubled force. Humiliations became continuous, and physical exercises became exhausting. Students were forced to perform hundreds of push-ups and squats under the mockery of the guards. The psychological climate inside the experiment completely collapsed in just 96 hours. Several more people, one after another, began to demonstrate signs of severe depression. They cried, refused to talk, and fell into a stupor. The rest of the prisoners completely submitted to the guards, losing the will to resist. On the fifth day, Christina Maslach, Philip Zimbardo's fiancée, arrived at the laboratory. She was horrified by how brutal the conditions of detention for ordinary students had become. Christina openly told Zimbardo that this experiment had turned him into a monster. Her harsh words forced the professor to finally wake up from his research blindness. On the sixth day, Philip Zimbardo officially announced the emergency closure of the prison. The experiment, designed for 2 weeks, was completely stopped ahead of schedule. The exhausted students finally left the dark basement of the university and were able to return to their normal, peaceful civilian life. Professor Zimbardo began a thorough analysis of the materials collected over 6 days. His main conclusion shocked the scientific world. The external situation is always stronger than a person's internal morality. If you put good people into bad, brutal frameworks of isolation, then the system itself will quickly force them to behave in the most monstrous way. The brutality of the guards was caused not by their personal vices, but by the role they received, just as the helplessness of the prisoners was a direct consequence of their lack of rights. This phenomenon Zimbardo later described in detail in his book called The Lucifer Effect. It became a fundamental textbook for studying the nature of human evil and conformity. After the Stanford experiment, the ethical rules for conducting experiments on humans were tightened forever. Not a single scientific instance ever again gave permission for such abuse. But Stanford was only the tip of the iceberg in the study of blind obedience to a system. 10 years before that, an even larger-scale experiment took place at Yale University. Its author was a young and ambitious social psychologist, Stanley Milgram. Through an ordinary newspaper, he hired ordinary people. Teachers, engineers, postmen, and clerks. They were told they would be participating in a study on the effect of pain on human memory. Before the subject teacher, they placed a device with 30 current switches. The voltage scale on this safety machine grew from 15 to 450 volts. The final toggles were marked with an ominous, frightening inscription: danger, severe shock. At the beginning of each test, 2 invited volunteers entered an empty laboratory room and pulled a folded slip of paper from a paper hat to distribute the rolls. But the drawer was rigged. On both slips, only the word teacher was always written. The second participant was always a professional actor who obediently pretended to be the victim. This actor, in front of the real subject, was seated in a chair and tied with straps. A heavy metal electrode was attached to his wrist to deliver electrical discharges. Then the subject teacher was led into an adjacent room, closing a heavy door behind him. There, in front of him, was that very intimidating generator with 30 toggles. In the corner of the room, at a separate desk, sat the experimenter himself in a gray coat. The teacher's task was simple: read word associations from a prepared list. If the learner made a mistake over the loudspeaker, the teacher was obligated to press the first toggle. The first discharge was only 15 volts and was practically imperceptible, but the rules required, with each new mistake, increase the current strength by exactly 15 volts. The voltage grew relentlessly. 30 volts, 45, 60, 75. At the 150 volt mark, the actor learner behind the wall began to complain of discomfort. He loudly demanded to stop this experiment immediately and release him from the chair. At this moment, the real subject teachers began to hesitate and doubt greatly. They turned excitedly to the scientist in the grey coat, asking to stop the procedure. But Stanley Milgram each time calmly and coldly pronounced the prepared instruction. He firmly said the first phrase: "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue." Under the influence of authority, people submissively obeyed and continued to press the current buttons. At the 300 volt mark, the actor behind the wall began to scream frantically and kick the wall. Yet after that, he completely stopped answering questions, plunging into a dead silence. The subject teachers began a real panic. Cold sweat broke out on them. They begged to check on the victim's condition, but Milgram pronounced the second phrase: "You have no choice. You must go on." The scientist harshly explained that an absence of an answer by the rules of the experiment equals a mistake. And this meant that the strength of the electrical discharge had to be increased again by 15 volts. The subjects were in a state of the wildest, unbearable internal conflict. They stammered, bit their lips until they bled, and some began a convulsive, nervous laughter. But if they tried to refuse, Milgram finished them off with the final phrase: "The responsibility belongs entirely to me." And this short phrase lifted the burden of conscience from people. They went to the very end of the scale. The results shocked the world. 65% of ordinary people reached the final toggle. They obediently pressed the fatal button at 450 volts, thinking that behind the wall, a person was dying. Not one of these subjects was a sadist, a monster, or a psychopath by nature. These were law-abiding citizens who simply blindly obeyed the authority of science. Milgram's experiment proved a person will easily commit the most terrible evil if personal responsibility is removed from them. Obviously, isolation with Harlow, frameworks with Zimbardo, and authority with Milgram hit the exact same vulnerable spot. Our social fabric and humanity are much more fragile than it seems to us at first glance. The participants in these dark laboratory experiments of the last century had no choice. But thanks to their great and terrible sacrifice, a conscious human choice has finally appeared for us.